The United States has begun attacking Houthi rebels in Yemen. The strikes began over the weekend. And the pictures you're about to see have been released by U.S. Central Command that is responsible for the Middle East. These pictures from yesterday, and it shows F-18s taking off on attack missions towards Yemen, attack missions that are attacking not just the Houthi infrastructure, but also Houthi leaders, apparently, this time. That is something that appears to be new about this latest round of U.S. strikes. Now, these airstrikes were all by missile strikes over the weekend. So the question is, why attack the Houthis now? Is it Donald Trump escalating against Iran, or is it just as the Pentagon says, to, quote, restore freedom of navigation in the region? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee.
And I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting, and I will be looking forward to getting your comments, your questions, and hopefully putting them to our guests, certainly as many as we possibly can. We have already had quite a few comments on our community post, so thank you very much for those. And it was the photo that we used of Donald Trump in that post that really caught people's attention. Jared Reed here can bring up the picture that we used in that post. It was released from the White House.
Let's bring that up, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully we can bring up that picture. There we go. It was released by the White House on the social media platform X. Trump there with his cap on saying, "Make America Great Again," with user Critter John commenting, "I like the fact he autographed his own hat." Now, some others actually not very impressed with the fact that it appears that he did autograph that. Others were wondering if Trump had just got off the golf course. We're not going to comment on that, but a few more comments that did come in on that community post. Jared Glover says, "Remember when Trump said he wanted to stop foreign wars?" Mango M5M says, "Don't let the pirates attack international shipping." Lone Star Patriot says, "The second the Houthis stop threatening ships and US assets, they will no longer be a target." And this last one from James Miller, "If Iran is the target, then the United States should have started pulling all its military personnel out of the Middle East, given that there is no safe country for them in the Middle East. So I think this is all just posturing." Thanks very much for those comments. As I said, that was on our community post. Please put your comments now into the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can a little bit later.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to all you guys who have already posted in the community chat. We do look forward to your comments, and we try and bring those into the discussion. And that discussion we will be having with Jared Reed, who sat at the table. You already saw Jared there. Jared is going to be giving us some context as to why it is that the Americans have begun a second round of strikes against the Houthis. And the reason we're calling it the second round is because under the Biden administration as well, you had strikes against the Houthis, although that was done in conjunction with allies. It's another matter, but Jared Reed will help us break that down. We also have Dustin Hemmerline, whom you do not see, who is sitting in the studio. I'm sorry, he's not in the studio, sitting with our technical crew, making the show in the studio possible, making this discussion possible. And we, of course, have Cherry Chan, who is at the table, making the chat possible. She is talking to you guys in the chat, and she'll be doing that throughout the discussion. But that's not the only thing she'll be doing, because there is something else as well, which is...
Of course, surprise, surprise. We have a poll question for you. Our question this week is, will this, meaning the latest latest situation, will this further destabilize the Middle East? There are 4 options. Yes, Iran will retaliate. Yes, Houthis will escalate attacks. No, Trump has it under control, or is unstable no matter what. So please vote, and we will talk about it later.
And we will be discussing the results of the poll, but then also hopefully the discussion that we have in the next hour or so will potentially inform your choices. At least we hope that is what will happen. But let's begin with some context. Jared Reed, the man for the occasion, help us understand why the Trump administration is attacking the Houthis. What has brought it to this stage?
Yeah, let's kick this off with a video. I think a lot of you will remember a pretty extraordinary video from the Houthis back in November 2023. Dustin, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up now. It's of the Houthis approaching this ship. This is them in their helicopter. They attacked and hijacked a ship back in November 2023 called the Galaxy Leader. Now, this is pretty audacious. You remember this, guys, don't you?
I remember this, yeah, especially this point of view shot. Was it like a GoPro that they attached to the back, or was there a cameraman that was hanging from the...
Yeah, one can only speculate, but video shows them approaching this ship on a helicopter and Houthi rebels then boarding the vessel. Now we'll see them, there they are, boarding this vessel and taking the ship and the crew hostage. Now, aside from the actual seizure of this ship, this was a pretty huge win in terms of propaganda for the Houthis, because footage of this raid went all around the world. We're talking and showing it now too. And so aside from seizing the ship, the Houthis then used it for other purposes too, which means we can bring up the second video I want to show you, Dustin. They used it for other purposes like tourism. We can see people there posing on the ship, walking around, taking selfies, enjoying themselves, and it said that they even shot a music video.
Gosh, so they were able to get onto this ship just like as a tourist, like you, me.
Exactly. And as I've read, they even shot a music video aboard this ship at one point. Now, the Houthis, why did they do this? They say that they attacked the Galaxy Leader over its connection to Israel, part of a much wider campaign of attacking ships aligned to Israel in the Red Sea since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war back at the end of 2023. Now, these attacks, you'll probably remember, were very, very significant because they affected global trade. They severely interrupted global shipping and supply routes, and that meant shipping companies had to halt their shipments through the region and find other ways to get goods from A to B. I'm going to bring up a map now. It's important to note that around 12% of the world shipping traffic, and if I can bring this map up, transits through here, the Suez Canal. This is the shortest route between Europe and Asia, and of course it needs to pass through the Red Sea waters off Yemen. So to avoid these attacks, you can see if we're looking between Singapore and Rotterdam, the blue line is the quickest way. To avoid these attacks, ships had to reroute down the southern tip of Africa and up to Europe. And this added sometimes weeks to travel time and, of course, greatly increased costs. Let's take a look, though, at this interactive map. This is a pretty interesting map I wanted to show you. This is by a group called the Yemen Conflict Observatory. This is displaying attacks since October 2023 until today. In reality, it shows the Houthis attacked more than just Israel and US-aligned ships. Many of these dots here belong to commercial ships of mixed-flagged origin. And that means some groups have described the attacks as discriminate. And certainly if there was attacks on Israeli-aligned ships, a lot of the time these links were pretty tenuous. That's what we've been learning. Now,
I mean, there was no way for the Houthis sitting on the shoreline right next to the shipping corridor to determine which ship is aligned with which country. And aligning with the country is also a very weird way of looking at it, because a lot of these ships are registered under different nations because of maritime laws. So how do you establish connections is something that was never clarified.
Exactly. And, you know, some of these ships have flags of one country but really are operated by another country. Yeah. It can be very hard to pinpoint. Now, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, he said a few days ago that in the last 18 months, the Houthis have attacked the US Navy vessels 174 times, commercial shipping 145 times. And so what effect has this had? As I just said, in terms of global shipping routes, I can bring up some information from the US Defense Intelligence Agency. Between December 2023 and February 2024, container shipping through the Red Sea declined by approximately 90%. This is huge. Now, the Houthis say their attacks on Israeli-linked vessels are in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. And so when the first stage of the Gaza ceasefire went into effect back in January this year, it halted these attacks. It's saying now, last week, that it would resume them after a deadline it had given Israel to allow more aid or to allow aid at all into Gaza. That deadline expired, and then it said it was going to resume these attacks. Now, that resulted in what we saw over the weekend, this statement from US President Donald Trump, who ordered a series of airstrikes on the capital Sana'a and said that the US would continue to use lethal force until the Houthi rebels stopped their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. It also came to this tweet or this statement with a warning to Iran to end support for the Houthis, immediately saying, America will hold you fully accountable and we won't be nice about it. That's from the US President Donald Trump.
And he likes sending out tweets like that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what do you call them? Tweets or posts when he's doing them on X or Truth Social?
Truths as well, sometimes on Truth Social.
It was an interesting point, you know, when you were showing those visuals of the Houthis boarding that ship. And it occurred to me, but I didn't want to break your flow. And it's something that DeVos has articulated in the chat. She says, real tough, Houthis invading a ship that has no ways to defend itself. And that's the truth, right? You had the Houthis land this helicopter. Well, they didn't land it. They just hovered above this ship, which really was defenseless. It is a commercial ship. It doesn't carry any weapons. There is not a gigantic crew to defend it. And it was real propaganda, right? I mean, that's what they were trying to do, but trying to send a message, and the message seems to have got through, right? And where is this ship right now? Do we know? Just because we showed that video.
It's still, as we understand, and I don't have the link, but it is still in possession by the Houthis. And as I understand, I think earlier this year the crew was the crew that had been held hostage for about a year. They were released, but as it stands now, the ship is still where it has been since it was seized.
I mean, we'll be talking to two experts who are aware of the region and generally what has been happening there, particularly since 2023. And we can generally look at what this basically has meant in terms of stopping the flow of shipping. I mean, you were showing that map, Jared, which had those orange dots on it. And I wonder, that's a live map, isn't it? I mean,
and those are in the chat, just to say to anyone who wants to follow along. Cherry posted those as well.
Exactly, yeah. You can sort of play around with that map from the Yemen Conflict Observatory and see, I guess, you can also select months, so different months in terms of when different attacks happened, and you can sort of narrow things down that way.
Right. Now, so have a look at that map, and we'll keep referring back to that map. And you might have other maps as well, Jared, which show the live flow of traffic potentially, but we can come to those in a moment. Let's just introduce our two guests who will be with us as we have this discussion on the situation developing between the Houthis and the United States. I'd like to welcome two guests. We have independent analyst Hannah Porter, who is joining us from the UK, and Senior Director of the Iran program at the think tank, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Behnam Ben Taleblu. I apologize, Taleblu, joining us from DC very early where you are, but thanks for making the time. Thanks both of you for joining us. Hannah, if I can just come to you first. Jared was showing that post on social media from Donald Trump. He talked about freedom of navigation. He talked warning the Houthis to stop attacking ships, and he was also issuing a warning to Iran to try and essentially stop the support for the Houthis. So what really is the real reason that Donald Trump is attacking the Houthis?
Well, I certainly think that early on in his administration, he does want to send a strong message to the Houthis, which is that they can no longer be disrupting trade and navigation in the Red Sea. So there is a very real reason for that. But also, of course, we see Trump more broadly wanting to be harsh on Iran and send a clear message to Iran. So I think that Trump sees this as being a potential win for him early on in this term. But of course, I don't think his administration fully appreciates how difficult it is going to be to deter the Houthis and prevent them from continuing to attack Red Sea shipping. There's a very real possibility that this is just a further escalation rather than a deterrent for the Houthis to carry out these attacks.
And we can expand that thought through the discussion. But just staying on the subject of Iran, if I can bring you in, Behnam, do you see it this way as well, that it's basically the Iranian regime that is being put on check by the Trump administration? And if so, why?
Well, great to be with you guys. Listen, long story short, I think Donald Trump is indeed trying to send a message to the government of the Islamic Republic and also to their partners, the Houthis, the entity that they've been really deepening ties with for really 10 years now. March marks the 10-year anniversary of the Arab coalition's attempt to actually dislodge the Houthis from Sana'a. But the reason this strike, this most recent package that came on March 15th, differs significantly is that it was a preemptive strike. You saw the U.S. under the auspices of the Biden administration put together a relatively small but credible maritime coalition, both for defense and an even smaller coalition, the U.S. and the U.K. for offense, to go and respond against launch sites and storage facilities tied to the Houthis. But those were all, again, kind of tit for tat in response. That doesn't mean there weren't dangerous things happening. For instance, there was the first ever U.S. use of the heavy stealth B-2 bomber, I think less than 6 months ago by the Biden administration. So for one, I think the U.S. is trying to kind of meet and exceed its own performance standards against the Houthis. Two, it's trying to send a deterrent message to the Houthis and to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Three, it's trying to signal to the Iranians specifically that the U.S. will indeed use preemptive military action here. And four, I think, given the rhetoric, the linkage between patron and proxy, it's signaling to the rest of the Iran-backed threat network in the Middle East that it will hold the patron responsible for the various fires across the Middle East. I mean, time will tell the degree to which the Trump administration will put political capital and sink political cost behind that. But long story short, it is indeed going to be seen, I think, as much more of a campaign, or will have to be seen as more of a campaign than a single operation, because the Houthis are not one to turn off their fire after one off. And you even had, I think, in Washington yesterday, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz alleged that this would have to be something ongoing.
If the U.S. is prepared to conduct preemptive strikes, and if they are indeed putting the regime in Tehran on check, why not conduct a preemptive strike against Iran? I'm not saying that that's what they should do, but just for argument's sake, why not do that?
Well, if you can signal resolve against lower-hanging fruit with less risk, it would be more prudent to do that. I mean, one of the reasons it's harder to deter a government which spends considerably less on its military is that for the past 2 decades, the Islamic Republic in the Middle East has had a kind of a low-cost, forward-deployed strategy where the regime has been able to fight a whole series of indirect, limited wars without ever paying the direct cost for a limited war against it. You've seen that cycle of violence actually begin to unravel this strategy of theirs since October 7. But in essence, I think the administration is looking to first try and signal resolve, but with an entirely different actor that has less risk and less capability. But that does not at all mean the Houthis don't pose any risk and don't have any capability, because even back when Hezbollah was at its fullest, prior to October 7th, the Houthis were and remain now the only Iran-backed actor in this network with medium-range ballistic missiles and with anti-ship ballistic missiles, and they're the only entity in history, in recorded history, to live-fire anti-ship ballistic missiles. So there are red lines that this even lower-hanging fruit kind of a group have crossed that others have not crossed before.
Hannah, how much is the Houthi regime supported by Iran? All these ballistic missiles that Behnam was talking about, is this all from Iran?
The bulk of it is. I mean, in terms of the percentage of the actual weapons that the Houthis have on the ground, it's difficult to approximate, but certainly the very serious advantages and increases in capabilities that we've seen over the past decade can be attributed to Iran, and not just in terms of the actual parts, the components of the weapons and the weapons themselves, but also in terms of training. So, of course, the Iranians have assisted the Houthis in learning how to build weapons themselves. So now we see also domestic production of pretty serious weaponry within Yemen. And of course, in the early stages of the war, the Houthis also achieved overtaking the arsenal of Yemen's former government. So they have quite advanced weaponry. A lot of that is attributable to Iran. The question is, can Iran just shut this off? Can they turn off the tap and mean that the Houthis can no longer attack ships or attack their neighbors? I don't think it's quite that simple. I think part of Iran's strategy that has been so effective is that they've set up a network of, if you want to call them proxies or allies or parties that are sympathetic to them in the region, that can actually operate autonomously. The Houthis don't need to be told at every step of the way by Iran, here's what you need to do next. The Houthis are very happy to launch missiles towards Israel, to support Hezbollah, to attack shipping, and Iran does not have to be telling them to do that. And the opposite might also be true, that let's say that Iran really is scared by these threats from Trump. If Iran turns to the Houthis and says, hey, cut it out, will the Houthis listen? I'm not entirely confident that they will, because the Houthis are very ideologically driven. They are a domestic Yemeni group with their own independent interests. And although they've benefited significantly from their partnership with Iran, that doesn't mean that they are 100% guided by Iran either.
I'd just like to jump in here, Hannah, because we have a question from Nile Chaturvedi, who says, this is just about sending a message to Tehran, but as experts have highlighted, the Houthis are now beyond Iranian control and have autonomy regarding operation command or attack decisions. What you're saying is that there is some although they are obviously an Iranian proxy, my question to you is, do they still have some independence? You're talking there about maybe Iran can't pull them back, maybe the US can't. But in answer to Nile's question, you know, what is the situation then with they in terms of can they be stopped?
They certainly do have some degree of autonomy, and we have seen, even just in the past year or so, the Houthis making their own relationships on the side very much independent from Iran. So we've seen them in conversation with Shabab in Somalia in terms of weapons deals. They certainly have some degree of relationship with Russia and communications with Russia. There have been Houthi delegation visits to Moscow in previous years. And I think even regionally, they have other relationships, and it's not so simple as just the Houthis are an Iranian proxy and 100% held responsible by Iran. So I think all of these things are important to consider. Of course, if the Iranians were to completely turn their backs on the Houthis and abandon them, that would very much change the game for the Houthis. But at the moment, that's not the case, and I think that the Houthis will look to diversify.
Hannah, it's interesting you mentioned Russia there, because I did want to bring this up. And
do you mind if I weigh in there for just 1 second?
I did want to come to you, but yeah, please go ahead.
There's a spectrum here of analysis, not just in Washington and not just around the world, but also between institutions, between governments, think tanks, and the academy, when we look at this thing called the axis of resistance. That's the constellation of terror groups, militia groups, what have you, violent non-state actors across the Middle East that is somehow beholden to Iran. There are groups that the Islamic Republic has created. Before Hezbollah in Lebanon, there was Badr in Iraq, for example. These are examples where the Iranians have really created these groups, and they are much more directly tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard or Quds Force. There's groups then that the regime has co-opted, groups like Hamas, groups like the Houthis. The success is that the model for success for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which does this kind of military outreach, is you find downtrodden and dispossessed persons and you put a gun in their hand. And actually that model of autonomy that Hannah was just talking about is the secret sauce. It's not that they have to get on the phone every single day and give targeting data, even though there are cases where they've done that even in Yemen. They bring the axis together to support itself. Since at least 2017, for example, you've had reports in Arabic language media where Lebanese Hezbollah has actually been on the ground. Since 2024, you even had an English language media where it's been the Quds Force, Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Houthis doing targeting. And Iran, as the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, sits at the nexus of two critical constellations. One in terms of state apparatus, states, what people are calling now the you could call it axis of evil 2.0, axis of authoritarians, axis of aggressors, which is Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And then Iran at that state level connected to a whole series of non-state actors, which is Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, even some of the violent non-state actors in post-Assad and pre-Assad Syria, as well as the constellation of Shia militias in Iraq. So the regime actually does do a lot to foster state to non-state relations, given this critical role, not just Russia, but China, for example, linking them up. But it actually encourages this actual individual outreach. Look at another group, for example, Hezbollah, moving in the mid-2000s into the world of narco-trafficking very heavily on three different continents, because they saw their patron was subject to financial sanctions. So these things that may look like Houthi autonomy, this is not kind of like a Soviet command and control relationship. This is a diverse, diffuse relationship where, unlike some in the academy who say, no, these are local actors with purely local interests, and unlike some in governments and capitals around the world would say, no, anytime Iran says jump, every group says how high. The real answer is that when the regime says jump, and the group can't or won't, Iran says, well, why not? What can I do for you to get you there? It's much more of a two-way dialogue. And that's been the success or the secret sauce behind how come this low-cost, high return on investment has been so lethal, has been so effective, and so hard to deter for conventionally superior militaries.
Can you dwell a bit on this axis between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran? And the reason I ask this is because there was reporting that the United States informed Moscow beforehand, before it struck targets, Houthi targets in Yemen. Why would Washington do that? What would it be hoping to achieve?
Well, even when you look at the history of the conflict in Yemen, and Hannah would know better than I, there was stuff even prior to when the Houthis took over Sana'a in late 2014 and before Operation Decisive Storm in 2015, where the U.S. in the past did look to Russia as a partner. Look at the way the Security Council used to vote, for example, in 2012 with the conflict there. 2013 was the first time that Iranian weapons were found in Yemen. And even in the early part of that conflict, the Russians did at least lend diplomatic support to some of the U.S. diplomatic overtures there, especially in post-protest, post-Arab Spring Yemen. So that could be one reason. Another reason could be a desire to kind of carry goodwill, particularly if the Trump administration is, in my view, somewhat mistakenly, trying to get Russia and Iran to disconnect the dots. You could see part of that playing out today with the way the U.S. is looking at Ukraine and Russia, for example. Perhaps they think if the Americans ease up on one theater, the Russians may help them out in another theater. There was just this historic phone call the other day between Putin and Trump. Perhaps there's a political element there as well. I can't tell you for sure what is the driving factor here, but I think it's quite clear that as much as the U.S. is trying to signal resolve, it's also trying to signal that it doesn't want to be the only one having to carry all this weight here. And that means that if you're going to be looking at dealing with the Houthis, you need as much diplomatic support, foreign kind of political support as possible. And at some point in time, you're going to need a ground game.
Maybe I'll come back to that a little bit later. I just want to sort of come to you, Hannah, and look at Yemen's internal civil war, not in great depth, but then can you help us understand how that is connected to the Houthis' reign of terror, if you like, in the Red Sea? How does one inform the other?
They're deeply connected. So the Houthis, from the beginning of these Red Sea attacks, have said that these attacks are justified in defense of Palestine, and that the real effort that is being made here by the Houthis is to dissuade Israel from further attacks on Gaza, and of course its occupation and blockade of Gaza. Now, that is a very popular line of propaganda for the Houthis. Of course, in terms of the timeline, it does add up. After October 7th, this is soon when we saw the more active attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthis, and they said that it was in defense of Palestine. But the reality is that this is a way of gaining popular support among a population that is under their control, but also other populations within Yemen and even in the region and potentially internationally. And I think it has been very, very effective, because I have seen personally, as a Yemen analyst, that I am called on much more frequently to speak about the Houthis. And that is precisely because the international community cares more about them. They're taking an interest in the Houthis now. I have friends and family in the United States who didn't have any interest in Yemen or certainly know who the Houthis were at all, and now are actually supportive of them because they are convinced that the Houthis are defending Palestine and standing up for human rights. So this was really an opportunistic thing for the Houthis to launch these attacks in a way that distracted from their own failings of governance at home, and also continuing warfare. And I think that this is something that maybe the Trump administration does not fully appreciate. The fact that the Houthis are in fact most comfortable at times of war, not in times of peace. Because at times of peace, they have to govern, and that's where their failings are really, really highlighted. But in terms of times of warfare, this is where the Houthis have existed for decades. I mean, since 2004, the Saada wars between Yemen's central government and the Houthis, through 2010, and then, of course, 2015 up until today, the Houthis have just been constantly at war. And so they can depict all of their failings at home as actually being the result of foreign intervention, whether it's by the US or the UK or Israel or Saudi Arabia. And now I think we're just seeing more of that. So this is really where they function best. And I think that if they can push forward in these military acts, especially being able to justify them as being in defense of Palestine or even defense of Yemen, that will gain them a lot of popularity and certainly a lot of credibility among what remains of the axis of resistance.
But they're also having an impact on global shipping, aren't they? I mean, like Jared was talking about the cost of shipping going up within the first few months of the attacks. Is that something that is also playing into their popularity?
Well, it's hard to say exactly how that feeds into their popularity. I think regionally, a lot of their neighbors are very alarmed, obviously, about the impact that it would have on Red Sea shipping, not least of all Egypt, given the Suez Canal revenue, but certainly Saudi Arabia as well. So I think that the decrease in shipping is maybe a side effect of this, and certainly a way for the Houthis to underscore how influential they are in the region. So now, as we've seen, even if the Houthis were to cease attacks on Red Sea shipping, this is a card that they will always be able to play in the future. Right. They will always say, if things don't go our way, we can continue or we can resume attacking Red Sea shipping. And that's where the real danger lies, is not so much if they stop, but if they lose the capability to do this. And I am not confident at all that the Houthis will lose that capability, because in order to threaten Red Sea shipping, it doesn't take really expensive missiles or really advanced technology. It can be some very simple drones just being flown into shipping, flown into a container ship, for example. And that would raise the insurance costs, even if those attacks are not very effective. And the insurance costs are really what matters. And that is what is causing a lot of the shipping to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope rather than going through Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal.
And just picking up on that, Nitro...
may I just add a footnote here on...
Oh, yeah.
May I just add a quick footnote here on... Before we get to the econ side of the shipping, you know, there were quotes actually from Qasem Soleimani, the former commander of Iran's Quds Force, in 2018, amid a war of words between then Iranian President Rouhani and then first-term Trump administration, where Soleimani was discussing options, and he said, you know, we can turn the Red Sea ablaze. For America. That line was really dismissed, even in Washington, even in Trump administration term one Washington, as hyperbole or bluster, like often you do here in Iranian military statements. But you just fast forward a few years and you see the Yemenis, the Houthis have actually been able to act on that dictate, that desire for turning the Red Sea ablaze and really ratcheting up the hassle factor, increasing the transaction costs for the Western, particularly European consumer when you look at East-West trade patterns. And then the other thing is, one reason why the Trump administration, I think from a foreign economic policy perspective, was keen to respond here, was because exactly this sword of Damocles that Hannah was just mentioning, that the Houthis could dangle, not just over Red Sea shipping, not just over Israel, but over any Western foreign policy decision that they would dislike. Remember, from phase one of the ceasefire starting in mid to late January, all throughout early March, the Houthis were trying to serve as a military backstop to the ceasefire, basically saying if the ceasefire collapses or doesn't move on to phase two or whatever, that we would resume our attacks on Red Sea shipping or on Israeli shipping going through the Red Sea, or perhaps even on Israel itself. And they re-upped that in early March. And I think that really did spook the new Trump administration to kind of try to do everything they can to prevent this veto that the Houthis would have over Red Sea shipping. And one other point on militant groups doing military things, obviously that's where they're most comfortable. Terrorist regimes are comfortable with terrorism. Groups who have a history of warfare are more comfortable in a state of warfare than in a state of peace. But the real challenge here is, how do you force them into a position of uncomfortability that also doesn't play to the advantages of peace for these groups? Because I remember falling out of my chair during the military parades. I was watching on TV the ones in Sana'a in September, the anniversary of capturing Sana'a in September 2022 and September 2023. The Houthis unveiling systems, literal carbon copies of systems that one would thought a state would not be willing to proliferate to a non-state actor. And then after the October 7 terrorist attack and Israel's response against Hamas, and then the commensurate attacks on Israel, and then Red Sea shipping, some of these newfound capabilities actually being used within months of being unveiled. Again, these are historic things that we have not seen from a non-state actor.
Let me just jump in here, because we've got to make sure that we include people in our chat who are posting questions. Going back, Hannah, to what you were talking about, and also Behnam with what you were just mentioning there. Nitro asks this question: can the Houthis be pushed away from the coastlines just with Air Force attacks? But given what we've just been talking about with drones and these other, this new technology, it sounds like it isn't necessarily that simple. Let me ask that, first of all, to Hannah.
Yes, so I think being pushed away from a certain area is different than being prevented access from that area. So let's say there was a round of airstrikes along the coast of Al Hudaydah, which is the Red Sea coast, and it was so severe that the Houthis could not be present there. I mean, first of all, we need to note that there are large civilian populations in the port city of Al Hudaydah and elsewhere along the coast. But even setting that aside, if you could somehow manage to push the Houthis back, that's not sufficient. You have to actually put in another fighting force that is capable of securing that area, of holding it, and of keeping the Houthis at bay. And that is the real challenge, and that is one of the underlying core issues in Yemen, is that local fighting forces that could potentially oppose the Houthis are not united, are not well supported, and are constantly shifting. So the armed forces that do represent the Republic of Yemen government are deeply fractured. Some of them are secessionists that are allied with the STC, the Southern Transitional Council. Others believe in unity. Others have other political backgrounds, and a lot of them are at odds with one another. So even the politics surrounding fighting the Houthis or taking territory from them becomes deeply complicated and also somewhat temporary. And this is why simply bombing the Houthis or carrying out a round of airstrikes anytime we are upset with their behavior is not a sustainable strategy. We have to have some opposing force and long-term vision about how are we going to change Houthi behavior or potentially defeat the Houthis. And I don't think we're anywhere close to having that strategy at the moment.
Behnam, you were talking a while back about putting a ground force, having some sort of force, boots on the ground. Are you talking about U.S. boots or U.S. forces on the ground? Or are you looking at people who are already in Yemen?
No, to clarify, I use the word ground game, and certainly anywhere in the Middle East where there's a local conflict, you certainly need local actors, or you certainly need actors who have a very vested interest in defending or changing those local kind of day-to-day battlefield events. So you had, even though the UAE kind of formally withdraw forces, you've had, proxy forces tied to the UAE. You have, exactly as Hannah mentioned, forces tied to the STC, the Southern Transitional Movement there, which, as Hannah also mentioned, do have secessionist tendencies. And when you look at Yemeni history, particularly over the past century, this was a country cut in two during the Cold War. So there are still significant population-based grievances that exist there. Also, of course, it depends on if you want to have really a quarantine mission against the Houthis, really to roll them back from certain territories that they've held, or cities that they've besieged in the past and been able to take over, or if you want to really just kind of dislodge them from government altogether and you want to go back to the internationally recognized government. There's a whole series of options here. But I think if you're going to have a air campaign alone, whether that's US or US-UK or US-UK and perhaps some other regional country, like Israel has done, I think, 2 rounds of major strikes now in 2024 and once in 2025. this has to be complemented, in my view, with something on the ground. And when it comes to, I think, the earlier question about coastlines and local forces, it depends what kind of capability you want to get rid of. You know, anti-ship cruise missiles, radars, batteries, those are relatively going to be static along the coastline. But anti-ship ballistic missiles, which are on mobile transporter erector launchers, no, those can be placed from further in-country, further out of range. You also have a whole series of storage depots that have been struck over the years. So the Houthis have tried to dig deeper. There's a whole series of tunneling activities. Houthi bases are not just above ground, they're subterranean. Think like Iran's nuclear facility at Fordo, but not as deep. But also think of some of the tunneling you've seen from Hamas. You know, these groups and entities do learn from each other because they've all kind of been subject to superior conventional air power. And that's why I'm saying that that is a necessary ingredient, but probably not the only sufficient ingredient. And I hate to be so crass, but when you're looking at military targets, there's always this kind of great debate, if you will, which is killing people or breaking things. And largely the US coalition has been looking at the breaking things world. There was a report, I think from a few hours ago, talking about the U.S. looking to potentially go after Houthi leaders. That could potentially be a way to affect local dynamics on the ground if you go after major Houthi leaders, if you go after Houthi command and control, or if you go after, like the U.S. tried apparently in 2019, 2020, some of the actual Quds Force managers that handle some of the relationships, be they the tech or the political or the military, with the Houthis on the ground there.
Wako... Oh, sorry, yes. Hannah, you respond, and then I just have one point. But please, after you, Hannah.
Certainly. Just on the point about killing people rather than destroying objects, I mean, that is certainly the dichotomy in the two options. And I think one of the reasons that going after individuals, targeted assassinations, let's say, of Houthi leadership, is not feasible is that the terrain in Yemen does not really allow for that. And I think that this has been a part of the discussion in recent months because we have seen Israel take out the leadership of Hezbollah, the leadership of Hamas, have these very, very powerful assassination campaigns that have decimated the axis of resistance. And so we think, well, why not just do the same in Yemen? Why not do the same with the Houthis? But the truth is the terrain and the geography is very different. The Houthis can hide out in a way that, frankly, Hamas and Hezbollah could not in Palestine and in Lebanon. But also we just don't have the intel on Yemen that the Israelis had on Hezbollah and Hamas. It's a very, very different context. Even looking at the geographical space, look at a map and compare the size of northern Yemen, of Houthi territory, with Gaza or with Lebanon. I mean, there's just no comparison. So we have seen the Trump administration already make claims about targeting Houthi leadership, but I think we need to be really skeptical because the places that Houthi leaders can hide are just vastly greater than was the case for Hezbollah or for Hamas.
Hannah, does geography and lack of intelligence therefore explain
just
how
briefly in response to that,
let me just ask Hannah this one question.
Briefly respond to that?
Let me just quickly ask Hannah one question and then you can come in, Ben, I'm sorry. Does geography and therefore lack of intelligence explain how the Houthis have been able to survive all these bombardments from the Saudis, from the Americans in the past? Is that it?
I wouldn't say that that's the only factor, but that is one factor. Now, I'm going to make a very messy analogy, and I'm sure that this could be torn apart by experts. But if you think of the Houthis in Yemen and the geography that they live in and the duration of their control, I think it's something similar to the Taliban in Afghanistan. The idea of like constant bombardment of a group and believing, well, of course, the US military, the greatest military in the world, could defeat this ragtag, so-called ragtag militia. But the reality is that it's not that simple, especially when you're just dealing with airstrikes. I mean, with the terrain, the mountainous terrain in Yemen, as it is in Afghanistan, airstrikes are not sufficient, and a ground invasion would be horribly misguided. So they're really, in terms of military options, it is limited. And I do think that, as was mentioned previously, it would have to be paired with other strategies. So, of course, we do see the FTO designation as an economic strategy now combined with airstrikes. But even that, I don't think will be sufficient. We can hurt the Houthis using those means, of course. But that is very different than changing the group's behavior or deterring them.
Is that what you wanted to bring in, Ben-Am?
Actually, believe it or not, the the topography parallel, the geography parallel. Yemen, just like parts of the linkage between Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, particularly like Afghanistan, much more mountainous when you compare. That doesn't mean that Lebanon doesn't have mountains, for example, but that's one significant difference with, the Eastern Mediterranean. The other thing is, of course, though, the Israelis had worked many years to penetrate those organizations. There's a whole debate over, Israel's domestic intel versus foreign intel. So who knows if there are some Arab countries, particularly bordering Arab countries or nearby Arab countries, that may have tried to penetrate these groups over the years. That's really just an unknown at this point. But there is significantly more ISR kind of coverage that the U.S. could contribute to the battlefield if it already knows something about the movements or the whereabouts of these leaders, or in fact, the movements or the whereabouts of some of the shipping routes. Remember, there are multiple ways to go after this problem. There is a domestic production capacity. Remember, even ISIS, when it was fighting a 80-plus coalition, an 80-plus country international coalition, was still able to invent weapons on the ground. So the Houthis are still able to significantly have a domestic production capacity, but you can still be much better about dedicating some of that ISR, that intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, not just to going after known whereabouts or known kind of patterns of military commanders, but after known shipping rates, shipping routes. It's significantly smaller. There's a Gulf of Aden component. There's a Horn of Africa component. There's a Persian Gulf component. There's, since 2018, 2019, per UN reporting, an overland, potentially Oman component. So it depends what you, if you're in charge of the government, devote those national resources towards, to what strategy you choose to put them towards.
Let me just bring in this question that I was trying to put to Hannah a couple of minutes ago from Warco, who is picking up on what we've just been talking about with the US and how this isn't easy, the terrain isn't easy, and it's you were also making the analogy between that and Afghanistan. Warco says, I don't see how the US restores deterrence without the Saudis, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and maybe even Russia assisting. Does that sound like that there is a possibility there that those countries would even want to get involved, particularly given the history with Saudi Arabia and Yemen? Hannah, if I ask you that.
That's for you, Hannah. Can you hear us?
Oh.
Well, I'm wondering if the line is frozen now.
Oh, both of them.
I do believe that line is frozen.
Behnam, did you hear that?
I think both of them.
Both of them.
Yes, I heard the question. I think
fantastic.
Hannah's screen paused for a second.
OK, well, would you be able to just answer that? So that question from Warco asking about involvement from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates,
International.
yeah, or even Russia, yeah, international, exactly.
About kind of internationalizing the coalition, in my view, there should be a significant regional role here. The problem is many of the actors in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, have been badly bitten by their experience from, again, something like the 10-year anniversary month that we're now in, March 2015, March 2025, Operation Decisive Storm. That was actually begun, if we remember, with Saudi airstrikes before there was a ground kind of military campaign. And also that was tied to both outgoing Obama, incoming Trump, pressure policies towards the government of the Islamic Republic. I think even though Saudi officials probably will privately tell you how much they still harbor a grievance against the government of the Islamic Republic, an attempt to engage in détente and manage their relationship, at least at the surface level, to avoid kind of a military spillover, kind of seems to be the Saudi MO today. It's a very different Saudi approach to Iran than, say, for example, that which we saw publicly and diplomatically back in 2019. So for me, as an American focusing on American policy, the great fear is if the Trump administration is linking these theaters together, the Houthis in Yemen, their patron, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then you want regional actors to come in, well, certainly you would want the Egyptians, who had lost so much major economic trade in the Suez Canal because of the Houthi military campaign there, but also you want the Saudis because of their military capabilities, and the Saudis say no because they are one of the few places that have not been attacked by the Houthis since October 7. And if the Saudis say we'll come back in again, but we need some kind of a guarantee from you, the U.S., that you'll have our back, and the U.S. may not be able to offer that. And worse, the U.S. track record with Saudi is not so good, particularly even under term one Trump administration, where you had the non-response, the non-military response to the major Iranian drone and land attack, cruise missile attack at the oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, which the Houthis first tried to take credit for, by the way. It's not going to end well. So I think depending on how you choose to internationalize this conflict, it can actually create a wider diplomatic drama. I see no reason, for example, to bring the Russians in militarily. I'm even skeptical of the political role they could play today. Again, today, 2025 is not at all 2012, where you can potentially get all of the P5+1 in the UN Security Council on the same side on this. You already do have an existing arms embargo resolution in an enshrined UN Security Council resolution. I say enforce what's on the books, create coalitions that are politically easy to manage, and don't spend limited time and capital trying to widen it just to get more numbers, because quantity is not always going to be quality here.
Okay. I do believe we have Hannah back on the line. Hannah, your line had completely frozen. I'm glad that you've been able to make it back. I'd just like, from where you are sitting, to know from you, based on everything that we've discussed so far, do you think that the United States has taken a long-term view of how it wants to deal with the Houthis, or is it just a bit of a show and trying to play power politics to try and boost maybe Donald Trump's domestic or international standing? Is there a long-term plan that you see that the United States has thought through to try and effectively deal with what they say is a problem?
I certainly don't see any long-term strategy or long-term plan, and not just with the Trump administration, but with the Biden administration or prior to that as well. So I think that this is a long-standing problem, is that most of U.S. policy in Yemen is reactive. The Houthis do something and then we respond. That has been the case for years. So I think it is true that this is an example of preemptive strikes, but it's still not going to be effective because it is not part of a long-term strategy. I think that really the U.S. and its allies should step back and think long-term about what they want from the Houthis and what they want from Yemen. What do they want Yemen to look like, and what is actually going to be feasible? Okay. So of course we would. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you'd finished. I thought that was my apologies, but please carry on, because there was a pause in the line. Please carry on.
No, absolutely. It's just I think that we should really consider what kind of behavioral changes we want from the Houthis. Is it realistic to remove them from power? They have held the capital, Sana'a, for now over 10 years. They do have a government in place. So we do refer to the Houthis, of course, as rebels, and maybe rightfully so, but they also run government institutions, and they have done so for a long time. They control the financial networks of northern Yemen. And I think that, again, as I mentioned before, the internationally recognized government of Yemen is not actually in a position to take over the entire country. And these are all factors that need to be considered in our long-term vision. So I think that going forward, it would be useful for analysts to really look at the Houthis in terms of their power structures, the key personalities, their ideology, and specifically examples in the past few years of where the Houthis have backed down or have negotiated their position. Because we see them as being this group that refuses to negotiate, that refuses to compromise, but there have been examples of them doing so. And so studying those instances and understanding what are the carrots and the sticks that could be used against the Houthis to at least change their behavior would be a better strategy than just launching overwhelming airstrikes against them that, let's be honest, are primarily going to affect civilians under their control rather than their leadership.
Okay. I'd like to expand this a bit to look at the immediate impacts on the Middle East with these current actions. I know we were talking about long-term, what could be done, but just let's look at what is going to potentially happen with these particular actions. If I can come to you first, Behnam, we were talking at the start of this discussion about Iran, and I'd like to bring in here that letter that apparently the Trump administration invitation sent to the Iranians, asking them to come back to the negotiating table and renegotiate a nuclear deal. I don't know if the Iranians have responded to that, but is the whole idea behind this, at least when the Iran angle is concerned, that the Trump administration wants the Iranians to come back and renegotiate what it clearly sees as a failed 2015 nuclear deal?
Well, this is one area where actually candidate Trump and President Trump, term one Trump and term two Trump, despite all the projection and commentary, has been remarkably consistent. I mean, even if you go back to the debates before 2017 when he came into office, I think 2015 or 2016, I forget which one, he distinguished himself from, at that point, a very wide field of Republican primary contenders who all said, I would tear up the Iran nuclear deal on day one. And his line, kind of consistent with everything art of the deal and whatnot, was I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. And if you saw what the Trump administration's term one Iran policy looked like, it was not at all a rush for the exits. First of all, it took about 6 to 9 months to actually develop an Iran policy, then about another 6 to 8 months of trying to work with the Europeans to fix the Iran deal. That failed. Then the U.S. left the Iran deal on May 2018, took 180 days to restore the sanctions that used to exist that were brought into law by the Obama administration and Congress prior to that deal, then another, 6 to 7 months to actually go and cut all of the oil waivers. So that thing, which is popularly called maximum pressure, which was designed to, generate macroeconomic shocks for the regime by going after major export earnings like oil, financial transactions, shipping, insurance, what have you, and then try to drive them into a bargaining position. We never got to that part B, that bargaining position, because, as I said, this maximum pressure campaign only really began in mid to late May 2019 and only had about a year and a couple months. Now, if the Trump administration really does have 4 years, it is clearly, if you look at that second presidential memorandum, NSPM2, that was signed in very early February, it is drawing on quite literally the exact same strategy, but with a much larger time horizon, this 4-year period. And I think it is in some degree free riding on some of Israel's military successes against the Iran-backed threat network in the region to kind of bolster its bargaining and its deterrent position. And perhaps by being tough on the Houthis, perhaps by cutting a few waivers, like more recently the Iraq-Iran energy waiver, it is trying to put the macroeconomic squeeze on Iran again, all again in the hopes of driving this regime to the table. And one can say whatever they want about Trump administration sanctions, but that letter that you mentioned is further proof that there has been consistency in outreach. You could comment on its style, you could comment on its substance, but empirically there has been outreach.
Hannah, could all that calculation change if the Houthis were to, I don't know, retaliate and expand the scope of retaliation the way they did when they were fighting the Saudis, for example, the attacks on Saudi oil refineries, Saudi energy infrastructure? If they started to do that and decided to up that compared to what they were doing when they were fighting between 2014 and 2022, the Saudis, could that change the dynamic that the U.S. currently has in mind when it comes to pressuring Iran?
Well, yes, it certainly would change that dynamic. And I think that all options are on the table for the Houthis right now, because they have sustained so many airstrikes and now more casualties under the recent airstrikes than they did under the airstrikes with Biden. So I think that the Houthis are seriously considering now all targets within the region. So, of course, Israel, Red Sea shipping, any U.S. interests, and potentially also targets within Saudi Arabia and with the UAE. Now, this is disastrous for Saudi Arabia, and it will be interesting to see how their response evolves in the coming months if Trump does continue to escalate against the Houthis, because that really puts the Saudis on edge. They are laser focused on Project 2030. They want to develop their economy and tourism. And if they have to do that while the Houthis are potentially launching missiles into their territory, then that is a very big problem for them. The Saudis have basically managed to extract themselves from Yemen and certainly end the Saudi-led coalition. And I think that that is what Saudi Arabia wants. That is the trajectory that they want. To be sucked back into a war that was started in 2015 is going to be a huge loss for the Saudis, and it's going to have very serious implications on Saudi-US relations. So I don't really see how further escalation is going to benefit the US's regional partners or even global partners. And I think it's another important point is that these latest airstrikes were not conducted as part of a coalition. So even under the Biden administration, the airstrikes that we saw about a year ago, that was with the support of the UK and, of course, some of our actions in the Red Sea with the support of other international partners. These were just American airstrikes. And I think that the possibility of continuing that as a long-term plan is not very feasible. We will need the support of regional and international partners, and I'm not sure where that stands at the moment.
So, Hannah, what does the US really want from Yemen then? I mean, we know that they're saying they need to stop, the Houthis need to stop targeting ships in the Red Sea, but is there a bigger plan there, or is that it? And we don't know, we just wait and watch.
Well, the bigger plan is a little bit vague. Yes, certainly we want to see the Houthis to cease all targeting of Red Sea ships, whether that's commercial ships, but also certainly American military ships. We want to see them cease all attacks or attempted attacks on Israel and on their regional neighbors, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but even domestically, their behavior would need to change. So obviously, in the past year, we've seen the Houthis detain civil society workers, people that used to work as security guards for the US Embassy, human rights activists, journalists. There's a whole slew of crimes that the Houthis commit against their own population, and I think that behavior would need to change as well. Now, how far the US is willing to go to actually shift that, I'm not really sure. But I think that early on, let's say post-2015, our goal was to remove the Houthis from power and to reinstate the internationally recognized government. I think on paper, that is still our policy, but that is becoming less and less likely as more time goes on with the Houthis controlling the capital and becoming so entrenched in northern Yemen. So normalizing the Houthis and recognizing the Houthis is also not really on the table, is not really an option. So it seems like right now we are in limbo, where we can't fully recognize the reality of the situation, but we're powerless to fundamentally change it.
Behnam, if I can come to you, you were talking earlier about potentially a meeting of minds, if you like, between the Israeli aims and the American aims to sort of destroy Iranian proxies in the region. And Alex, earlier you were talking about a report that the Israelis did coordinate with the Americans when the Israelis recently restarted their campaign against Hamas in Gaza, so that this could follow the American campaign against the Houthis. Do you think that there is a joint campaign here to remove Iranian proxies from the Middle East once and for all?
I think it would be good to see one, but if these are the green shoots of a joint campaign, I would say that there is much more breadth than depth to it at the moment. The problem is, if you do want to be in the business of using military solutions to deal with military problems, you're going to also have to be in the business of coming up with political solutions to political problems, and that's where the other element of U.S. strategy in many of these theaters where Iran has been able to build up and create or co-opt proxies because of the political chaos that tends to lead into this cycle of violence that does, target Israelis, American interests, localized Arab interests, what have you, pro-status quo interests, you could say. And if you're going to zoom out even further and kind of add Yemen into the mix as well as kind of this now most powerful element of the axis of resistance, the administration and perhaps even the Israeli approach remains, I think, one of a management approach. But really the lesson of October 7, even within Israel and Gaza, that you can take and extract and apply to the rest of the region is sometimes when you think you're managing the problem, more often than not, the problem is managing you.
I think we're going to just try and wrap up and try and sum up where we are right now. Let me come to you, Hannah. If you can look ahead, how do you see this U.S. campaign against the Houthis shaping up in the next few, I don't know, should I say months or weeks?
Well, it sounds like it's going to be an extended campaign. What the end date is unclear, but certainly it seems like we can expect more intense airstrikes on Houthi targets. So that might be in Sana'a, it might be in Al Hudaydah. Now we've seen, I believe, that Marib has been targeted as well. So I think that will continue. Now, the response to that from the Houthi side, I'm very comfortable in saying that they will escalate. I don't think that we will see the Houthis backing down anytime soon. That has historically just not been their response. So the rhetoric will escalate, and also their attempted attacks on, for example, USS Harry Truman, other U.S. interests in the Red Sea, and potentially commercial shipping will likely continue or restart, probably resuming targeting of Israel. And anything that they can do to emphasize the fact that they are major power players that are willing to face off the U.S., to stand down the U.S. And I think that that will continue. So unfortunately, the Trump administration pitted against the Houthis is not a great combination for de-escalation. I think that both sides, there is pride involved, and there will just be further escalation until I'm not sure when someone has to sustain substantial losses, or maybe someone else would step in and try to de-escalate. But I don't think it's going to be the Houthis that will be de-escalating anytime soon.
Bernam, how do you see this shaping up?
Again, I think this is a management approach the Trump administration is going to be taking. And I think if the Houthis are going to be escalating in an increasingly conventional space, they're going to find themselves increasingly conventionally outgunned. Now, I think there's a internationalization of the conflict that has already affected, the shipping interest of some reportedly 60 different countries, the economic interest of some 90 to 100 plus different major international shipping, insurance, energy firms. But that really is the linkage of this in the Trump administration's mind to the counter-Iran campaign, rather than just the kind of counter-regional proxy terrorism instability campaign that they have there. Because if there really is going to be a connecting of the dots, holding the patron accountable for the weapons it has put into the hands of the proxy, for example, then we may be entertaining those much larger, harder questions you asked very early on into this, which is at what point would the administration go against the regime directly? So that's something in terms of contingency planning that, if the administration is going to marry its deeds with its words, is going to have to taking very, very seriously right now.
And that's certainly something that's coming out a lot in the chat, that people are thinking that that there certainly will be something targeting Iran next. Do you think, from what you're saying then, Bernam, will the hope be then that the strong wording and what the Trump administration are doing towards the Houthi rebels in Yemen will be enough of a message to Iran not to get involved further?
You want to basically put the fear of God into the regime. You want them to back down. On the one hand, when you look at more recent comments by IRGC commanders, they're talking a big game about securing their own territory, and they're also talking a big game about the independence and the local nature of Yemeni actors, trying to make everyone forget that the military capabilities in the hands of the Houthis today, and particularly the long-range strike stuff, far from the kind of scuds that existed in Saleh's arsenal, or the C-801 anti-ship cruise missiles that existed in Saleh's arsenal back when the Houthis overran the capital and absconded with part of the army and part of the arsenal, are really carbon copies, and sometimes even field manufactured versions or upgrades or updates to existing Iranian long-range strike capabilities. And I think the regime is trying to get the president to disconnect the dots, and there's no need to have to rush into a war with the government of the Islamic Republic. There's a whole host of other, as we mentioned, military options here that could be based on going after the supply side of this problem, which is some of those weapons still coming in either in whole parts or component parts, going after the Quds Force networks in the region, going after where the Houthis are trying to integrate with the rest of the axis in the region. I believe there was even recently, I think last year it was, in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, Houthis killed a Houthi individual killed alongside a KH, a Kataib Hezbollah official.
Right. We'll leave that there for the moment. Ben Taleblu from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Hannah Porter, thank you both for joining us. I did see somewhere in the chat people saying great experts today, and we wholly agree. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
And we also have the results of the poll that we promised we would bring. I see you've closed the poll, right?
Yeah,
do you want to share the results with us?
You were a bit criticised, weren't you, for closing it a bit
too
early?
Sorry, next time I will announce it before I close it. Maybe that's better. Sorry. Anyway, I'm going to repeat our poll question. With this, meaning this recent escalation, recent situation, further destabilize the Middle East. We've got 304 votes. 38% goes to it's unstable no matter what. 24% says yes, Houthis will escalate attacks. 20% says yes, Iran will retaliate. And 16% says no, Trump has it under control. So I guess people's faith in Trump, it's not winning
I
here.
wonder how much of this discussion informed that choice. I wonder, because I think the direction was quite clear in terms of how committed are you to what goal, and that wasn't coming across. But 38% believing the area remains unstable no matter what. Pretty sobering.
And we've got here, look, Cherry in the chat from Carolina. Commenting.
That's my
on
middle
that.
name.
Yeah, that just happened. That just happened. Yeah, Cherry in the chat. I think we're going to stick with it. We internally refer to Cherry also as Cherry in the chat. Chand, but maybe, I don't know, you don't like that, do you?
I think it's a nice name.
Yeah, I think it's a nice name.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I like that.
I have to say that the chat today was a bit, I think we call it spiky. It was a bit spiky. There were some, certainly some different views and some people who had to be sort of silenced for a short amount of time.
Disrespectful comments there. And I encourage people to ask more questions to our experts, which is related to our discussion rather than...
Exactly, and we absolutely are not, you know, in any way trying to block people's thoughts or whatever, but we do have to try to keep it on message as much as possible. Otherwise, it goes all over the place. So I hope that you can understand that. We did have some really good people, some really good comments. I have to just... say a shout out to Nile Chativerdi, who asked put so many very intelligent comments and questions in the chat.
But he does that regularly. I keep seeing Nile's comments, and there's always a lot. It's always very well researched, and I always appreciate seeing those comments. I'm glad you bring them in as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I know that some of you, we didn't get round to asking your questions, but I hope that you got some answers through our excellent guests. So thank you very much for that.
So that's it for today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Cherry, for your work on this. We are going to be back again next week on a subject that we don't know of.
But we will let you know about 24 hours before we go live.
And
stay
tuned to the time zone, because there was some confusion because some places have changed to daylight saving.
I'm glad you're dealing with that.
Yeah.
And I don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
There was a program I used to deal with. With those time zones, it drove me mad. But we try to get it right. But see you all next week. Thanks so much for joining us this time. Bye.